I'm Leslie Budowitz. I'm president of Sisters in Crime. It is September 16th, 2016, and I'm here in New Orleans at VoucherCon with Marcia Talley, who was president of Sisters in Crime from 2009 to 2010. Good morning, Marcia.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining us in this oral history project.
It's a delight to be here.
Thank you. Congratulations on the release of your 15th novel, Footprints to Murder. Would you tell us a little bit about your writing career?
Gosh, I started writing, well, I think a lot of us started writing long before we got published, and certainly that was the case with me. I think I started writing about the early 1980s because there were a lot of people in my life who needed to die, and it was cheaper than a therapist. So I was working on a mystery, but I had a full-time job. I had kids at home, so it wasn't a top priority for me. Around the early 1990s, I hooked up with Sisters in Crime.
And how did you find out about Sisters in Crime?
I was working in Washington, D.C., do the superwoman thing. Had a high-level library job at the government, what they call now the Government Accountability Office, the Waste, Fraud, and Abuse people. And one of my coworkers was a mystery fan, and she knew about Sisters in Crime. She said, there's this group of women, they get together on Saturdays, and you might be interested. So I went to the first meeting, and it was at a seafood house in suburban Washington, and I walked in. I didn't know anybody, and sat down at a table with two women, and we discussed, the books that we were thinking about writing. None of us were published. And one of those women was Sujata Massey, and the other was Laura Lippman.
And so initially you were part of the Chesapeake chapter of Sisters in Crime. How did you become involved with the national organization?
Gosh, how did I get involved with the national organization? I think it was at a Malice Domestic Conference in Arlington, Virginia. And I was out to dinner with a bunch of women, writers, who were members of Sisters in Crime. And I remember we were in one of those underground malls, and we were walking along, and Catherine Hall Page cornered me and said, "Wouldn't you love to be secretary of Sisters in Crime?" And I thought, I don't even know what that means, secretary. But I said yes, and so that's how it happened. I signed up as secretary, and I did that for a couple of years. And then I became vice president, and then president, and then I served on the board for another year after my presidency was over.
Marcia, when you served on the board, what were the biggest challenges and needs that women crime writers had at the time?
I think some of the biggest challenges when I joined the organization there were two mainly. One was that for most of us, writing is a very solitary business. And if we're new, we haven't had a book published, we don't know anybody. And you can't just go up to Sarah Koretsky, for instance, and say, "Hi, I'm writing this book." So I think that for me, the biggest advantage of being a member of Sisters in Crime at the time was the networking. I got to know other writers. I got to know people who were trying to become writers. I got to learn the craft. I got to know the business. I like to say, if you're going to be a surgeon, you don't just say, "I'm going to be a surgeon," and then you go start operating on people. You have to go to school. You have to learn the business. And I think it's the same way with writing. So for that's what I got from Sisters in Crime. They helped me learn how to become a professional writer, so that when I had a book that was ready to go, it made an impression, and it followed a certain amount of rules that the industry would recognize as this person knows what they're doing. And then the second thing that was really important for all of us back then, and was the reason that we were founded, was women were writing more than 50% of the books, but they were getting about 20% of the attention. And by attention, I mean in the published reviews in the newspapers of the day, in the awards field. There were some organizations like Mystery Writers of America that mystery writers belonged to, but women were not, they didn't form, a huge part of that organization. They didn't get the kind of recognition that the guys did. And Sisters in Crime started to turn that around. Another thing that we thought about on the board was our membership, and we wanted to grow the membership. And we would reach out to, everyone was encouraged to reach out, bring people to meetings, and trying to get membership that way. But another thing that we did is we started a series of workshops. Before BoucherCon, which is the annual conference that we're attending right now, and we would have one prize for members and then another prize for non-members, and the prize for non-members was more than it would cost to join the organization, and so we drew members in that way, because we would have maybe 150 people, 100 people attend these incredible workshops, and they would join the organization. And the other thing we did is we didn't raise our annual dues for years. I think it was around $40. And during my term as president, we allowed people to join as lifetime members. So you could pay one fee and then you'd be a member for life.
So the membership figures show that during the recession in 2008, 2009, which was while you were on the board and the year before you became president, membership did take a hit. And what you've just explained are some of the creative ways that Sisters dealt with the need to keep the doors open, keep money flowing, and yet recognize the realities of both published and unpublished writers in the economy at the time.
Right.
What were some of the major programs or projects begun during your year as president? You mentioned the workshops. Let's talk about those.
Right, yeah, I think the first year that, in 2009, we had a Sink into Great Writing workshop. And it's continued every year since then. And they've covered things like how to get published. The most recent one was how to write about diversity. How to plot, how to become a professional writer, all of these wonderful, how to learn to be a professional writer.
So in January of 2010, Sisters in Crime began the We Love Libraries Grants Program, giving $1,000 a month to a library somewhere in the country to buy books. Tell us how that came about.
The We Love Libraries program, I think, germinated because we had a lot of members who were librarians. In fact, I was a librarian myself for 30 years. We have always had a close relationship with the American Library Association. I believe we're the Friends of the ALA or something like that, Gold Star members. Or
Library champions.
Library champions, right. And we had money in our treasury that had come to the organization through something called the Authors Coalition. And it's kind of hard to explain, but this is money that comes from foreign countries for photocopying and use of library materials, and they can't really identify an author to pay it to. So it is distributed in the United States to organizations like Sisters in Crime, Mystery Writers of America, Romance Writers of America, and so on. We have this money that has to be used not on our membership specifically, but on the class of mystery readers and writers in general. So we wanted to spend it wisely. And somebody on the board came up with the idea of grants to libraries. We would try it for a year. And we turned it into this wonderful program where librarians would go online to our website, they would register. The only rule was they had to post a picture of themselves with books that were mysteries. They didn't have to be by our members, but you know what? They almost always were. And then we literally drew names out of a hat. And then every month for a year, somebody would win $1,000, which in this market for libraries can buy about 50 books, which is really nice. The program was so successful that it continues today. So that was 2010, and we're still doing it.
In that same time period, 2009, 2010, is when Sisters in Crime first began using an online management system. Can you tell us more about how that came about?
Well, we didn't really have any online management system at all for Sisters in Crime. We had a series of databases. We had a mailing list. We had another mailing list for different things. We had one for our newsletter. We had another for membership. We had, basically it was a paper system. And so the board got a committee together, and we started looking at association management packages. Turnkey systems that could be used by organizations like ours to run everything that we need to do. And we identified one and bought it and hired somebody to take all of our databases and merge them all in so that we now have an integrated system that handles our membership, our conference registration. We can do emails with it. It's a website. It has a banner along the bottom where our new titles can scroll across. It has, everything that a comprehensive website would have, but it also, behind the scenes, will manage our day-to-day operations.
Another program that began while you were on the board is Sync Links, which is the popular monthly e-blast of news you can use.
Right.
And in fact, you are still the editor of Sync Links. Tell us how that came about.
Sync Links was kind of, I wouldn't say it was my brainchild, but I kind of raised my hand to do it. And what happens is there's a team. There are about 7 of us, and we read newspapers, we are online, we read blogs, and we find articles that we think will be of interest to our membership. And they send them to me, and every month I'll compile an online news. It's kind of like a little news blast that goes out to members with the links, and there'll be a little intro about it. And I try to categorize it. So the first part of it has to do with the industry, what's going on with the bookstores, what's going on with publishing, what publisher has merged with what other publisher. And then the next thing I talk about is our mission, which is women in crime, in mystery fiction. And then maybe I'll move on into craft. And then at the bottom, I almost always have something that's humorous, just for fun. And then the last thing that we do is we keep track of, using Publishers Weekly, we keep track of the deals that our members are getting.
And those come from Publishers Marketplace,
correct.
Don't they?
So, and also people send me information because not everything gets into Publishers Marketplace. But I think it's very helpful for our members to know what is going on with other members, who is getting deals, who are their agents, what publishers are picking up these things. So you can see patterns. For instance, right now you can see that a lot of what are called cozy mysteries are going to maybe 4 or 5 publishers. So if you're new in the business and are looking for a publisher, you can see that this deal was with this publisher and it was unagented, for instance. And that might give you a clue about where you could go. And also sometimes we don't say how much the dollar amounts were on these deals, but there's a range, like $0 to $49,000 is a nice deal. And so we'll say, this was a nice deal. And that would give our readers some idea of, what the money situation is in our business.
And that's a tremendously useful resource. SyncLinks is, in fact, one of the most popular resources that Sisters in Crime has. No kidding. During the time that you were on the board, we also updated and republished Breaking and Entering, our guide for entering the business. Were you involved with that project as well?
Yeah, for my sins, I used to be. Breaking and Entering was a very popular publication that had been done maybe about 15 years before the time you mentioned. And it was literally mimeograph sheets. Remember mimeographing? stapled together. And we could not keep them in stock. Everybody wanted them. And what it was is our members themselves wrote short, like one-page essays on various aspects of breaking and entering into publishing. And we all, with the board at that time, thought that we needed to update that. So we did, we updated it. And then I had been, when I was a librarian, I did a lot of technical services and computers and programming and stuff like that. So I was, again, I raised my hand. I had this problem, my hand goes up. And I agreed to format it and publish it through one of the self-publishing sites. And so we did that, and it came out really well, and it sold fairly well and made money for Sisters in Crime, but mostly it helped our authors.
And somewhat related to that is the project that began in 2010, and I believe it continued into the next year, working with Bowker and using their PubTrack survey to do a comprehensive study of mystery readers' buying habits, which was publicized quite widely. Can you tell us about that?
Right, that was really exciting, and we did a study called, we partnered with Bowker to do a study, a comprehensive study of buyers' reading habits. And what the result was, they have a comprehensive database of who's buying what kind of people they are, and divided by all kinds of things, age and sex and race and just about everything you can think of. And the result was a very slick publication, and we got very broad coverage for the Bowker report. It was, we had articles in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, the Washington Post, who would mention the study, and then people could go and look at it. And I thought it was very interesting, and we also learned, how people found out about books.
Yes.
So one of the most startling things to me on that study was that the biggest reason that people bought a book was because somebody said, "This is a really great book, you need to read it." And that just blew me away. And it emphasized for me the importance of organizations like this, of getting the word out, of just talking about our books and what you write and what you write. I don't know whether I'm making sense or not.
You are. One of the things that we learned from that study was that blogs, newsletters, even published reviews all had their fans and all brought readers to the books. But the most common way that a reader said she found a book was word of mouth.
Yeah.
And that, of course, can encompass a lot of things, can't it?
Right.
But we learned what some of those ways were and how individual writers could then leverage that to expand their own readership.
Right. I think that it happened a while ago, that report, that I think that the findings are still relevant today.
They are.
Yeah.
I know that you are particularly proud of the work done to obtain tax-exempt status for Sisters in Crime, which began during your year and then was completed the next year when Kathy Pickens was president. Can you give us a little history on that?
Well, way back in 1986, when we were founded, we were licensed, Sisters in Crime was licensed in, or whatever you do, copyrighted or whatever, in Lawrence, Kansas. And we thought at the time we needed to not pay taxes because we were not, we were a group that was a service group. So we consulted, or whoever was in charge then consulted with a local attorney in Lawrence, Kansas, and we were told that we couldn't be a charity, a 501c3 organization, because we weren't a charity. And so the issue was tabled. But years later, we decided to bring up the whole issue of tax status again. And this time, through Kathy Pickens, who helped us locate this attorney, we hired a professional tax attorney who specialized in associations like ours. And he looked at what we did and said, well, no wonder you're not a charity. You're a business league. you need to apply as a business league, which is a 501c6. So he helped us, and we had to make some changes to the way we did business, and in order to qualify for the status. They weren't huge changes, but one of the big major ones is we had to have, at that point we only had membership. You were either a member or you weren't. But in order to be a business league, you had to have membership tiers. You had to have like members and non-members, or members and associate members or something, which seemed like a small thing, but for some of our members this was a big deal. We had always prided ourselves on not discriminating and not saying, well, authors are here, and if you're not an author, you're over here, and so on. So we had to tread very lightly around that, but we managed to convince the membership that these tiers, we made them actually self-selecting. When you join Sisters in Crime, you can say I'm a writer. You don't have to say I'm a published author. You can say I'm a writer, or you can choose to be a reader, and that qualified us for that. And then, but we had to change our bylaws, and so we did that, and we made a few other tweaks, changed our bylaws, and then. During that whole time, though, we were under investigation by the IRS. They were the attorney that we were working with. There were IRS agents that were looking very closely at us, and we were treading on eggshells. We had to make sure that we didn't, for instance, advertise one author over another, because show preferential treatment for one author over another, because that doesn't make us a big business league. That makes us a promotional organization of some sort. So it's all very tricky.
And of course that ties in very closely to the original concept of Sisters in Crime, that we are a sisterhood that promotes all authors and not just one over another.
Exactly.
So it's a natural connection, isn't it?
Yeah. So eventually, I believe it was the next year, I was still on the board, but I was, past president, and my husband and I had taken we were on a sabbatical. He's a college professor. We were on a sabbatical on a sailboat on a tiny little island in the middle of nowhere. I hadn't seen email in weeks. And we pull into a dock, and I get off the boat and find the internet signal, and I log on, and there's an email message. We've gotten our 501c6 status for tax exempt. And I was doing high fives all over this restaurant. They must have thought I was totally nuts, But it was really, really important. And not only did we get the tax status, but they made it retroactive. So all the taxes we had paid in the previous, I think, 3 years were refunded. And this was a serious 6-figure amount of money.
Marcia, you were involved with 2 publishing summit trips and reports. Would you tell us about those?
The publishing summit reports were started maybe about 3 years before I became president, but continue to this day. And the idea behind them was to gather information about the industry to pass on to our readers and to our members. For instance, I think the year before I got involved personally, they went to New York and they talked with agents and editors to find out, what are editors buying, what does an agent do, kind of thing. The 2 trips that I was involved with, the first one, we wanted to know what happens between the time a book is published and it gets into the hands of a reader. There's this vast space in there. It doesn't happen by magic. There's stuff in there. So we went to look at distributors, the middlemen, and we visited several in the Midwest. Most of them were in the Midwest for some reason. But the biggest one was Ingram, and Ingram is in Laverne, Tennessee. A humongous operation. It was just mind-boggling to see how quickly a book could be actually produced, because they also have Lightning Source, which is a self-publishing thing, and get out onto, someone's into the FedEx truck. So we went and we looked at all of these distribution channels and reported on them to our members, and it opened everyone's eyes. For instance, we learned that if you're an author, or if you want a book and you get the order in to Ingram by noon, it's on the truck the following morning. And their automation, where they have men in roller skates going around and pulling all these books for orders for libraries, and they go on. It looks like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. They have all of these roller coaster kind of things and bins that go down, and it'll come by something, and a little arm will shoot out, and the book will go into, and down another chute and into a box, and then the boxes get picked up and go somewhere. So it was really, really interesting. The next year, we decided to look at 4 of the big players in publishing and information dissemination: Amazon, Google, Apple, and a new upstart e-publisher called Smashwords. So we did a trip. There were 4 of us. We went out on the West Coast. We spent a whole day at Amazon, where we learned, to our surprise, that everybody at Amazon loves books. They love books. In the cafeteria, there are quotes from books all over the walls. They're not just this monster e-book thing. They actually love physical books, and that everybody working at Amazon at that time, almost everybody in a high-level position, came out of New York publishing. So they knew about publishing, and they knew what the problems were with legacy publishing, and they decided that they were going to invent something that didn't have those problems. And as we know, they're tremendously successful. Google was incredible. We spent a day at Google. We were on the campus. We discovered if you worked for Google and you got tired, you could go sit in a massage chair. The cafeteria had ethnic foods from every. You could have roast beef on one end to Thai food on the other. You never had to go home. There was a gym, there was washers and dryers, and literally you never had to go home. Then we went to Apple, and we learned what Apple was doing. And of course, Apple was in competition with their iBooks with Amazon, and also for information with Google. So we got a fuller picture of what was going on then. And then we went to Smashwords, which was a one-man operation, and he was doing e-publishing for people. And he had interesting perspectives on, he wanted it to be quality, and had, if you just couldn't send in any crap and have it go online. It had to meet certain standards.
And that's Mark Coker, the founder of Smashwords, you're referring to.
Yes, Mark Coker. And we went out to a taco restaurant. So,
Smashwords has grown beyond the one man since then.
I'm very sure it has, but it was his vision.
Yes.
And at the time, he was the only person who was really, really doing that kind of ebook publishing for people and disseminating it the way he was. So those were 2 incredible trips. I'll never forget them. And it just opened my eyes, and I hope that our reports helped the membership. We learned a lot, for instance, from Google, that authors could use, that they offered that you could use as an author to promote your work.
Let me switch gears here, Marcia, and ask, what do you see as the greatest needs of women crime writers today? And related to that, what challenges do you see ahead for Sisters in Crime?
Oh gosh, challenges ahead. Well, the greatest need, I think, is the greatest need for all of our members is what it's always been, a need to get together with like-minded people so that you don't have to slog it out alone. And, getting the word out to people who would need that could benefit from our support. I often go to meetings of, other organizations. They find out I'm a mystery writer, and they say, oh, I'm writing this mystery. You talk to them. And there was a librarian who was the librarian at my grandson's elementary school. And he went in, he was fourth grade, I think. And he wanted books on Japan, and she started talking. He says, my grandmother writes mysteries. And she said, oh, that's really very interesting. And many years later, she moved to Annapolis, where I live, and got in contact with me. And she said, I'm writing a YA, a children's mystery. And I said, well, you really should join Sisters in Crime. And she did. Not only that, she became a guppy. And for purposes of this interview, Guppy stands for the Great Unpublished. It's an internet chapter that we have of people who want to become published that has a tremendous success rate. So she joined, became a Guppy, and is actively writing, and now she's trying to get published, and she's going about it in the right way. So I think that is still one of our challenges, to reach out and pull in these women and men too. We have misters in crime. Pull them in and help them reach their goals. And so that is the biggest challenge, I think. And also, and that goes along with growing our membership too. And I think the more we grow our membership and reach out not just to women but to men, that our main mission, which is getting recognition for what we do in the world at large, will come true.
Marcia, what's your favorite memory from your years on the board of Sisters in Crime?
Gosh, how do you pick a favorite memory with the association with an organization that goes back, for me at least, until I think 1993 or 94? It's really hard to say. There are the times at conferences in hotels when you get together and it's like this big slumber party and you're having popcorn and drinking wine and just trash talking. It's just fun. But for me, I think the best memory I have is the day that I found out that the tax exempt status that we had worked for so long with the IRS had been approved. My husband and I were, it was the year after I stepped down from the presidency, but I was still on the board. My husband was on a sabbatical, and we had gone off on a sailboat into the Bahamas. We were cruising around from port to port. Internet was hardly, you couldn't get internet like you do today. You had to go somewhere, and we would sail around and I'd say, oh, there's a tower, go over there so I can get the internet. So we pulled into this little island, this little beachfront bar, anchored the boat, got in a dinghy, went ashore, and I got out my computer and logged on, and there was the message. We'd gotten our 501c6 status, and I was just running all around the restaurant. I didn't know anybody there. They must have thought I was insane, giving high fives. We got our status. So that to me is the happiest memory anyway. And I thought it was all that work that we had done for years and years and years had finally worked out. Yeah.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with us about your term?
Okay, I have a lot of memories. It's really hard to single one out over another, but one story I like is I was at the Sisters in Crime breakfast, which, as you know, is like at this unholy hour on a Saturday morning, 7:30, and I think we were in St. Louis, and I was still on the board then and really tired because I'd had a late night. I had a panel coming up, and we did the breakfast, and everybody's wandering around, and I'm wandering out, and I see a cell phone on the floor. And I thought, well, I wonder whose cell phone this is. So I picked it up, and I looked at it, and it said, and I thought, well, I'm going to find out. And I touched a few keys, and it said V.I. Warshawski. And I said, I think I know whose phone this is. This is Sarah Paretsky's phone. She's our founding mother. So I went looking for her. She had been at the breakfast and gave her phone. And I had never really chatted with her before, but I had her phone. So I love that memory.
Marcia, what 3 words would you use to describe your experience with Sisters in Crime?
3, that's another trick question. 3 words. Sisterhood is one. I think that support and recognition. Is that good?
Marcia Talley, that's terrific. Thank you for sharing with us your experience as president of Sisters in Crime, and thank you for all the work you've done for the sisterhood.
Thank you.